Welcome to this Blender modeling tutorial. I will do my best here to explain and show everything you need to know to be able to model, texture and export 3D models, perhaps something like this house, so that you can, for example, import them in a game. I'm using Blender to make assets for City Skylines. I won't assume any prior knowledge of Blender, I just assume that you have installed it. I don't think the exact version will matter much. I'm currently using 3.5. I strongly recommend to use a full-size keyboard and a 3-button mouse with a scroll wheel. Just using a laptop keyboard and a touchpad will not be fun and make this tutorial harder to follow. Then a few words of encouragement. If you are new to 3D, you will likely find this fairly informationally dense. Try not to feel disheartened if you don't get everything immediately. Pause the tutorial, try things out for yourself, take breaks and get back to it. Just like learning to play a musical instrument, 3D modeling takes practice. I certainly was frustrated in the beginning when I got stuck, but you will find that you get stuck less and less. It may also be tempting to skip the beginning, since it may seem that we only look at a boring cube for a while. But the concepts I go through are fundamental, and you will be much less confused later on if you know about them. So try to be patient, it will pay off. Okay, let's begin. When you start Blender, it will show a splash screen with some options and a list of your recent files, if you have any. Just select New File, General. The Blender window consists of a couple of sub-windows called areas. Each area displays a certain editor. Blender has a number of different editors, each one with its own purpose. If you click on the icon in the top left corner of any area, you can select which editor you want to show in it. You don't have to change any of them now, since the default is fine. You can resize areas, click on a border between two areas and drag. If you move your mouse to a corner of any area, the pointer turns into a little cross. If you drag now, you will create a new area and you can select an editor to display in it. To get rid of an area, right-click on the top border and select Close Area. These buttons up here are called Workspaces. They are essentially just predefined window layouts. You can rename them, delete them, and create your own. For now, stay in the workspace called Layout. If you want to start over and get the default back, either close Blender and start it again, or click on the logo at the top left and select Splash Screen and then General again. Or go to File, New, General. We won't need the timeline area at the bottom of the screen, so close that if you want. In the largest area, you have the editor called 3D Viewport. In it, you have a cube, a lamp, and a camera. The scale here is in meters, so this default cube, centered at the world origin, has a side of 2 meters. Since we are not going to do rendering or lighting in this tutorial, but only modeling, we won't need the lamp or the camera, so you can delete them by clicking on them and hit Delete. Click an object to select it. Press Shift D to duplicate it. You can hold Shift while you click to select more objects. Press A to select all. Click anywhere on the background to deselect everything, or press Alt-A. Hold and drag to select everything inside the rectangle you draw. You can try out different selection tools up here if you click and hold on this little arrow, but I usually stick with a select box. Use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. Press the scroll wheel, that is the middle mouse button, and move the mouse to orbit around. Hold Shift, press the middle button and move the mouse to move around without changing the angle. You can also use the gizmos up here to do all this, but using the mouse is much easier. The basic transformations for objects are moving, rotating and scaling. You have these as separate tools to the left, but it's faster and more convenient to use the keyboard shortcuts instead. When you have an object selected, hit G for grab to move it, hit S for scale, and R for rotate. You can press escape to abort most operations if you change your mind. You can combine any of these, moving, rotating and scaling, with one of the letters, X, Y and Z. So if you hit G and then X, the object will move only in the X direction from left to right. Same with Y, front and back, and Z, up and down. And the same goes for scaling. Type S and then X to scale only in the X direction, and so on. If you type R and then Z, you only rotate around the Z axis. You can also press Shift X, Y or Z to affect the other two axes. So for example, hit S and then type Shift Z to scale in the XY plane. There are some handy view hotkeys you should know using the numpad on your keyboard. Press 1 to view from the front, 3 to view from the right side, and 7 to view from the top. Hold Ctrl at the same time to get to the other side, so Ctrl 1 gets the back, Ctrl 3 gets the left, and Ctrl 7 gets the underside. You can also press 9 to get to the opposite side of what you are currently viewing. And finally, you can press 5 to toggle the perspective on and off. You can find all this under the View menu and then Navigation, and also see the hotkeys. Finally, if you get lost, you can press Home to center on the objects in your scene, or the key next to 0 on your numpad to zoom to what's currently selected. When you open Blender, you are in Object mode, as you can see up here to the left. In Object mode, you move, scale and rotate whole objects. If you have an object selected and press Tab, you will enter Edit mode. In Edit mode, you manipulate the internal structure of objects, what is called the object data or the object mesh. You will jump back and forth between Object and Edit mode, and you do that with Tab. Object mode and Edit mode look very similar, but have different uses, and a major source of confusion in the beginning is that you are in the wrong mode. So just have a look to the upper left. In Edit mode, you see little black dots at the corners of our cube. Each of them represents a vertex. They are mathematical points with 0 size. The three fundamental entities when modeling are vertex, edge, and face. Up here you have the Select mode. By default, it's set to vertex, that's why we see them at the corners, and they get selected if you click on them. You can grab them with G and move them around. If you click on this middle button, you will go into Edge Select and be able to select edges instead, move them, scale, and rotate them. And if you click the third button, you will go into Face Select, and now we can select faces, grab them, move them around, scale, or rotate them. You use these three a lot, so they have keyboard shortcuts 1, 2, and 3. Not on the numpad, but the standard numeric keys. If you look to the upper right and click this button, you turn on X-ray. This is good for selecting parts that are hidden when seen from your current viewpoint. If I press numpad 1 to get front view and try to select the whole cube, I will only get the front side. But if I turn on X-ray and do the same thing again, I will get the whole cube selected. If you press 3 and look carefully, you will see a little dot in the middle of each side of the cube. This indicates a face. These dots may look insignificant, but it's very important to keep track on your vertices, edges and faces. You can see in the lower right how many you have of each. Behind the scenes, Blender are splitting faces into triangles, which are the trees count you see. This is a central number when making models for games, and you need to keep an eye on it. Up here you also have buttons for viewport shading, which affects how your model is displayed. By default it's set to solid, but if you click the one to the left, you will get wireframe instead. The next one to the right displays material, which we haven't talked about yet, and the one furthest to the right is for rendering, which I will not cover in this tutorial. Let's go back to object mode for a while and create some more cubes. To the right you have a hierarchy, which is a tree view of everything you have created. It's called the outliner. You can use it to select things instead of clicking on them in the 3D viewport. You can name things. If you double click on a label, you can type in a name. You can also rename a selected object directly by pressing F2. You can also organize objects into collections. Right-click and select New to create a new collection. Then you can drag objects into it. You can move it around within a hierarchy and everything in it will follow along. I strongly suggest that you stay organized and give things descriptive names. If you right-click on a collection, you can make copies of it or delete the whole collection. Obviously, be a bit careful with that. But as long as you haven't closed Blender, you can always undo things you regret with Ctrl-Z, and also redo steps again with Shift-Ctrl-Z, as in many other programs. You can toggle the visibility of individual objects and whole collections with the little eye symbol. You can also see the difference between objects with orange icons and the underlying object data with green icons. If you want to create a new object, make sure you are in object mode. You have an add menu up here, but it's easier to use the shortcut Shift-A. That will bring up a menu of things you can create. The most useful things for modeling are probably plane, cube, circle and cylinder. As you can see in the outliner, you now have a new object. If you press Shift-A in edit mode instead, you can still create things, but they will become part of the object you already have active. You won't get a new separate object. And if you make a copy of it with Shift-D, the whole thing will be copied to a new object. There is another kind of copy in Blender that's called instances. If you have an object selected and instead of Shift-D press Alt-D, it looks just like a normal copy. You get a new object, as you can see in the hierarchy. However, when you expand here, you see that the object data is shared. This means that in object mode, it's a separate object. You can now move, scale and rotate it, since these are properties on the object level. But in edit mode, they are all the same. So if you edit one of them, you will edit all instances, since on the level on the object data, they are all the same. Perhaps you won't use instances for a while, but I wanted to mention that they exist, and it's important to understand the difference. If you click on the eye next to the root node in the hierarchy to hide everything, you still see this symbol in the center. This is the 3D cursor. This is where objects get placed when they are created. Shift right-click to place it, or use the cursor tool. You can snap the cursor to any object, or any object to the cursor, by right-clicking and selecting Snap Selection to Cursor. Sometimes you move it by accident, then you can go to Object, Snap, Cursor to World Origin, or press Shift S to bring up a pie menu, and then select Cursor to World Origin, or press 1. Each object has an origin. It's marked by a little yellow dot. This is where the object is anchored in 3D space, and this affects the results of rotating and scaling. If I move the object a bit and then rotate or scale it, it will do so with the origin in the center. If I right-click and select Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor, and do the same thing again, the behavior is different. You can set the origin back to be centered on the object via the same menu, Set Origin, and select Origin to Geometry. If I'm in object mode and move the object, as we have seen, the origin will move along with it, since it's an object property. If I instead go to edit mode and move the object's mesh, the object origin stays. To now get the origin and the object in the same place, you can use Origin to Geometry again, or the opposite, Geometry to Origin. The area to the lower right contains the Properties editor. Almost everything in Blender has properties, objects, cameras, lights, the scene itself. Under the orange icon are the properties of the active object. The result of any transform you've made is stored as transformation values. You can also modify the object by entering values here instead. But these values are not yet permanent to the object's mesh. You can still undo the effects of moving, rotating and scaling separately if you go to Object, Clear, and select any of Location, Rotation and Scale. But if you want to make these transforms permanent, you can go to Object, Apply, or use the hotkey Ctrl-A and select All Transforms. Notice how all transformation values jumped back to their defaults. The object transformation was transferred to the object data. Notice also how the object origin jumped back to the world origin. If you select more than one object, the last one you selected will get a yellow outline. That is the active object. Other selected objects will have an orange outline. Even if I deselect everything, I still have an active object. As you can see in the outliner, one object is still highlighted. This determines which object will be active for editing if I enter edit mode, and also affects the behavior of many tools. So you can obviously have more than one object selected, but only one active, and that is always the last one you've selected. When moving things, you can use snapping to get either exact increments or to snap to other objects. You toggle snapping with Shift-Tab. It will light up this little magnet icon. In the drop-down next to it, you can select which kind of snapping you want. You can snap to the background grid, to a vertex, an edge, or a face. Play around with the different variants and options to get a feeling for how they work. You can also activate snapping by just holding Ctrl, and snapping works in both object mode and edit mode. When you move, scale or rotate objects, you can enter exact values. So if I hit G to grab an object, then X to restrict movement to the X direction, and enter 4.2. It will move 4.2 meters in the positive X direction. If I hit S to scale, type Z and enter 5, it will scale the object with a factor of 5 in that direction. If I hit R, then Y, and then -30, it will rotate 30 degrees counterclockwise around the Y direction, and so on. You may have noticed that whenever you perform an operation, you see this little pop-up. It's the operator panel. If you expand it, you can enter exact values and make other choices as well. If you enter values, you can drag to enter the same value in all fields. You can even do math in here. It disappears if you start on another operation, but if you have only clicked it away, it can be retrieved again with F9. At the bottom of the screen you have a status bar displaying mouse button shortcuts and the key map for the active tool. If you have more than one object selected and scale or rotate them, the result will depend on which pivot point you have selected. Make your choice in this little drop-down. We can compare, for example, bounding box center with individual origins. If we take the active element option, it will depend on which object you selected last. When we manipulate objects, we do so in a coordinate system. The default is global, where axes are oriented to the world space, but sometimes it's more convenient to work in the local system of an object. If we first rotate this around the y-axis, hit G and then Z, it moves along the global Z as usual. But if we select local transform orientation, it will now move according to the orientation of the object. You can separate a part of a mesh and turn it into a separate object. Go into Edit mode and select, for example, a face. Right-click and select Separate, or press P, and then choose By Selection. You can now see in the outliner that you have a new object. You can do the reverse and merge separate objects into one. Go to Object mode, select all the objects you want to merge, right-click and select Join, or press Ctrl J. If you do this in this case, you will not be back at exactly the same state as you were before. You can see that you now have 12 vertices instead of 8. If you go into Edit mode and turn on X-ray or Y-frame, and then make a selection around one of these, you see that what looks like one vertex is actually 2. You can merge them as well by selecting them, or everything with A, hitting M for merge and select by distance. You can also turn on Auto Merge Vertices by clicking on this button up here to the right, so that they will merge if you, for example, snap them to the same place, but it wouldn't have prevented the duplicates we got when we merged different objects. Be aware of duplicated vertices, since they are prone to cause confusion and problems, but now you know how to get rid of them. Faces have a direction that is determined by its normal. The normal is perpendicular to the face and can therefore point in either of two directions relative to the face. This direction matters, especially when exporting to a game. Cities Skylines, for example, only draws the front side of faces, so if one is turned the wrong way, it will be invisible. If I separate this face from a cube, rotate it 180 degrees, and put it back, everything looks the same, but the face and its normal is now turned into the cube. We can see this by going to this menu, Viewport Overlays, and activate Show Face Orientation. Blue means front and red means back. We can also click on this drop-down for Viewport Shading and turn on Backface Culling. This stops Blender from drawing the backsides of faces. You may get inverted normals by accident, often when using mirroring or negative scaling. If I move this cube to the left, apply the transform to reset the origin and then mirror it along X. Apply the transform again, the cube will be inside out. I don't even have to move the object, I can also just scale an object -1 in any direction and apply the transform. This is Suzanne, by the way, Blender's test model. Blender is pretty good at fixing normals pointing in the wrong direction if you tell it to. Go into Edit mode, go to the Mesh menu, Normals, or use the shortcut Alt-N and select Recalculate Outside. This also has its own hotkey, Shift-N. With an object selected, right-click and select Shade Smooth. Blender will now interpolate between the face normals at every point on the surface, giving an impression of a smooth surface. This works outside Blender as well, for example in many games. In Edit mode, you can select a part of the mesh and smooth just that. Okay, that was everything for part 1. Please like and subscribe if you watched this far. We have covered quite a lot. We've talked about Blender's user interface with areas, editors and workspaces, how to navigate in the 3D viewport, how to transform objects in object mode, how to manipulate their meshes in edit mode. We've talked about vertices, edges and faces, the outliner editor, and using collections, the importance of staying organized, different shading options, how to make copies and instances of objects and the difference between the two, the 3D cursor, object origins, applying transforms, the difference between selected and active object, using snapping and typing in exact values, the operator panel and the status bar, pivot points, the use of global and local coordinate systems, merging and separating objects, duplicated vertices and how to get rid of them, and face normals. If everything seems very abstract or confusing right now, that is fine. Play around with these things, view this again. Next time we will go through important tools, object modifiers, some more things you can do in edit mode, how to work with materials and texturing, and then you will have learned enough to really get going.